During one of our riding excursions, we encountered Napoleon, who was returning from Sandy Bay, whither he had been to visit Mr. D, who resided there. He expressed himself delighted with the place, and spoke in high terms of the urbanity of the venerable host of Fairyland. This gentleman had passed all his life at St. Helena, and had at this time arrived at the advanced age of 70 without ever having left the island. His appearance was most prepossessing, and to those who love to revel in the ideal and imaginative, he might have been likened to a good genius presiding over the fairy valley in which he dwelt. Few years after the emperor's visit, Mr. D was induced to come to England, and thinking that he might never again return to his lovely and beloved valley, had a tree felled from his own fairyland, from under the shade of which he had often viewed the enchanting scenery around, and had his coffin made from the wood. His arrival in England, together with his interesting character, being made known to the Prince Regent, afterwards George IV, His Royal Highness desired that Mr. D might be presented to him. And he was so gratified with the interview that he afterwards knighted Mr. D, who subsequently returned to the island, of which he was so much enamored. I asked Napoleon if he had remarked, when at Sandy Bay, 3 singularly formed rocks shaped like sugar loaves and called Lot's wife and daughters. He replied that he had. I then related to him an anecdote connected with the largest of the 3. More than half a century had elapsed since 2 slaves who preferred a freebooting life to one of labor and subjection secreted themselves in a cave halfway up the declivity, which terminates the spiral rock called Lot's wife. From this stronghold, their nocturnal sallies and depredations were carried on with great success, and their retreat remaining for a long while undiscovered, they became the terror of the island. They were at length, however, tracked to the rocky hold, where they stood a long siege, repelling all attacks by rolling stones on their assailants. It was at last deemed necessary to send a party of soldiers to fire on them if they refused to surrender, but this measure was rendered unnecessary by the superior activity of one of the besieging party, who managed to climb the rock, reached the opposite side of the mountain, and clambering up still higher to gain a situation above the cave, the mouth of which became thus exposed to the same mode of attack which had effected its defense, so that when one of the unfortunate freebooters approached the edge of the precipice to roll down stones, he was crushed to death, and his companion, who was following him, severely wounded. Many of the islanders believe to this day that the ghost of the murdered slave is seen to make the circuit of the wild spot wherein he carried on his nightly orgies. A superstition giving to an airy nothing, a local habitation, and a name. In St. Helena, every cavern has its spirit, and every rock its legend. Napoleon, having listened to my legend of the Sugarloaf Mountain, said he should regard it with greater interest the next time he wrote in that direction. Chapter 11. To horse. Now there is nothing gives a man such spirit, leavening his blood as cayenne doth the curry, as going at full speed. Byron. Deadwood. Races. Mameluke. Fete at Ross Cottage. Napoleon's attempt at singing. Visit to Madame Bertrand's. The Emperor's English. Plantation House. Napoleon's method of fighting over again his battles. One of the many instances of Napoleon's great good nature and his kindness in promoting my amusement was on the occasion of the races at Deadwood, which had been instituted by the Honorable Henry John Roos, the present member for Westminster, and which were at that time anticipated by the inhabitants of the island as a kind of jubilee from having been, as was often the case, in arrears with my lessons. My father, by way of punishing me, declared that I should not go to the races, and fearing that he might be induced to break his determination, lent my pony Tom to a friend of his for that day. My vexation was very great, and not knowing where to get a horse. And I happened to mention my difficulty to Dr. O'Meara, who told Napoleon, and my delight may be conceived when, a short time after all our party had left the Briars for Deadwood, I perceived the doctor winding down the mountain path which led to our house, followed by a slave leading a superb gray horse called Mameluke, with a lady's side saddle, and housing of crimson velvet embroidered with gold. Dr. Mira said that on telling the emperor of my distress, he desired the quietest horse in his stable to be immediately prepared for my use. This simply good-natured act of the emperor occasioned no small disturbance on the island and sufficiently punished me for acting contrary to my father's wishes. By the pain it gave me to hear that he was considered to have committed a breach of discipline in permitting one of his family to ride a horse belonging to the Logwood establishment, and for which he was reprimanded by the governor. We were told by Napoleon the next day that he had witnessed the races from the upper windows of General Bertrand's house. He expressed himself much amused by them. He said he supposed I was too much diverted by the gay scene to feel my usual timidity. The emperor frequently urged my father to correct me whilst young, and said I ought never to be encouraged in my foolish fears or ever permitted to indulge therein. He said the Empress Josephine suffered the greatest terror in a carriage, and he mentioned several instances of her extreme fright, and he was obliged to reprimand her severely. If I remember rightly, the Duchess de Brantes mentions in her Memoirs of the Emperor one of the anecdotes in this subject, which he recounted to us. There was so very little to vary the monotony of Napoleon's life that he took an interest in the most trifling attempts at gaiety in the island, and he generally consented to our entreaties to be present at some of the many entertainments which my father delighted in promoting. On one occasion, my father gave a fete to celebrate the anniversary of my birthday at a pretty little place he possessed within the boundary of the Emperor's Rides, called Ross Cottage, so named as being the abode for a short time of a highly esteemed friend, the flag captain of the Northumberland, whom Napoleon always designated as un bravissimo uomo. When the festivities were at their height, we descried the emperor riding along the hillside towards the house, but on seeing such an assembly, he sent to say that he would content himself with looking at us from the heights above. I did not consider this was fulfilling his promise of coming to the party, and not liking to be so disappointed, I scampered off to where he had taken up his position and begged he would be present at our festivity, telling him he must not refuse, since it was my birthday. But all my entreaties were unavailing. He said he could not make up his mind to descend the hill to be exposed to the gaze of the multitude who wished to gratify their curiosity with the sight of him. I insisted, however, on his tasting a piece of birthday cake, which he had been sent for that occasion by a friend from England, and who, little knowing the strict surveillance exercised over all those in any way connected with the fallen chief and his adherents, had the cake ornamented with a large eagle. This, unluckily for us, was a subject of much animadversion. I named it to Napoleon as an inducement for him to eat the cake, saying, "It is the least you can do for getting us into such disgrace." Having thus induced him to eat a thick slice, he pinched my ear, calling me a saucy simpleton, and galloped away humming, or rather attempting to sing, with his most unmusical voice, "Viva Henri IV."